when it was getting very serious, we all formed up in battalions in the different parts of the country and drilled our soldiers. And there was one night we went to the hall, and when we went to the hall, we were told we were confined to barracks for the night. They said there was something happening that wasn't to be divulged.
Now, there had been rumours of gun, but we had no idea what we were going to do that night, although we had a suspicion.
And we weren't told until we paraded that night at 7 o'clock on the Friday night, the 24th of April, 1914, what the operation was all about. And we were given the option of falling out if we didn't want to go on with it, you see. But nobody did fall out.
What the operation was all about, what they were being mobilized for, was something coming in from the sea that night. A large consignment of arms and ammunition on board the Clyde Valley, a coal boat, for the Ulster Volunteers. The arms, which had been purchased in Germany, were brought into Larne Harbour on the 24th of April 1914 to the waiting companies of the Ulster Volunteer Force.
Actually, I was in the signalling section of the Harbour Company of the Volunteers, and I was with the chap who sent the message out to the Clyde Valley. She came round the corner, you see, called her up by lamp to tell them that everything was in order for her to come on in.
Over 26,000 rifles were loaded onto waiting vehicles.
But there were over 800 vehicles that night passed through Larne. And as far as the police were concerned, they made no attempt to interfere.
The Ulster Volunteer Force was now a formidable army. 100,000 men, many of whom were now well armed and more determined than ever to resist any British government attempt to impose a Home Rule Dublin Parliament on Ulster. And the Home Rule Bill was, by the spring of 1914, steadily making its way towards the statute book. Carson was now in a very strong position. His and Ulster's claim was for Ulster to be excluded permanently from Home Rule. The government offered only individual Ulster counties the right to opt out, and only for a limited time. Carson and his supporters would have none of this. Not that it was going to be rejoicing and plain sailing from now on. For Orange Day 1914, Carson spoke of grim possibilities ahead. The lesson of Larne has taught you what discipline means, what can be achieved. I see no hopes of peace. We must be ready. In my own opinion, Carson told the Ulster Volunteer Force, the great climax and great crisis of our fate cannot be delayed for many weeks, when we shall have once more to assert the manhood of our race. He had his own army and a provisional government prepared to take over Ulster as soon as Home Rule became law. In trust, it was said, for the Constitution of the United Kingdom. In fact, there had been no such naked threat to the Constitution of the United Kingdom for nearly 3 centuries. What would the British government do? Well, of course, it had its own much more powerful force, the British Army, a substantial part of which was in 1914 stationed here on this windswept plain in the middle of Ireland, the Curragh in County Kildare. But a few weeks before the Larne gun running, something had happened here which put at risk the whole ability of the British government to enforce the law against Ulster Protestants in Ireland. The officer class in the army at that time were a conservative lot and sympathetic to Ulster Protestants. And the officer in charge here, General Sir Arthur Paget, asking guidance of the War Office on how to act if his officers refused to march against Ulster. An odd question, really. Still, Paget, asking guidance of the War Office, was told that those of his officers who actually lived in Ulster could be allowed just temporarily to disappear, while the rest would be dismissed from the service. Whereupon Paget asked his officers outright, would you march against Ulster or prefer to be dismissed the service.
General Sir Hubert Gough of the Cavalry Brigade and 59 of his officers said that if asked this, they would choose to be dismissed the service.
The effect of these events, this incident at the Curragh, followed by the uninterfered with gun running of the Ulster Volunteers at Larne, the effect of these events on Southern Irish nationalist Home Rule opinion here in Southern Ireland can well be imagined. And Southern Irish nationalists now began to look seriously to their own means of defending Home Rule against Ulster.
It was being realized now that it would no longer be enough for Home Rule leaders, men like John Redmond and John Dillon, simply to make the sort of powerful Home Rule speeches they'd been making for years, though they did continue making them, agreeing only to a temporary exclusion of some Ulster counties from Home Rule, a concession which Ulster would have nothing to do with. Nationalists had already started their own volunteers the year before.
We met in Wynn's Hotel in Abbey Street. There were several committee meetings, first of all, and then we decided to hold a recruiting meeting, and we selected for that purpose the enormous skating rink, at the Rotunda Gardens. We had an overwhelming crowd of putative volunteers, and we had ready for them forms which they would sign with their address and so on, so that they could be put into companies and eventually into brigades.
About this same time, a small workers' citizen army was formed, distinct from the volunteers and imbued with the extreme nationalism of Larkin and Connolly, but primarily there to protect working class interests. The Irish volunteers, with former NCOs of the British Army, had been drilling without arms or with hurley sticks and wooden rifles. Like their Ulster counterparts, to be effective, they needed arms. The actual initiative for the Southern Volunteers had come from the secret Irish Republican Brotherhood, but the vast majority of the volunteers knew nothing of this and joined to strengthen the British government's resolve to put all Ireland Home Rule through. But how were they to get arms? One Sunday, volunteers paraded at Fairview Park from all over Dublin, without knowing what they were parading for.
The order was given then to march, and we set off for Howth, still not knowing where we were going. We arrived in Howth at the end of the quay and took a snack, and then we noticed men coming up from the harbour with rifles. And in turn then we went down and each of us got a rifle, handed up from a yacht lying alongside the wall.
The rifles and their ammunition had been purchased in Germany and brought to Howth with the help of his wife and a friend by the ardent, half-English, half-Irish Home Ruler Erskine Childers. Only 1,600 rifles altogether, of which 900 came into Howth this day to be distributed by boys of the National Scout Movement, the FINA, to the waiting volunteers who then set off with the rifles for Dublin.